listening to the Virginia Press Room,
a joint production of the Virginia Public Access Project
and VPM. Now here's the host of the Press Room, Michael Pope.
In the Press Room this week, we are joined by an all-star panel of journalists from the Virginia Press Corps. First up is the health and housing reporter for the Virginia Mercury. She's about to become president of the Virginia Capital Correspondents Association, Charlotte Renee Woods. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
We are also joined by the state politics reporter for WTVR CBS 6 in Richmond, Cameron Thompson. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be on the new evolution of the podcast.
Rounding out our all-star panel of journalists, we are joined by the energy and environment reporter for VPM News, Patrick Larson. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Michael. I'm happy to be here.
All right, let's get right into it with our headlines of the week. Charlotte Woods, you're first on this. What's your headline of the week?
I guess I've enjoyed the big three constitutional amendments. It's a long, tedious process, but to have things be stronger protections within the state constitution, it's harder to put them in there in the first place. So the big three that Democrats have largely campaigned on last time and are now getting the chance to push forward are an attempt to enshrine abortion protections into the state constitution, to allow for people with felony convictions who have served their time to automatically have their right to vote process restored, and then also to remove a 2006 era prohibition that is still in our constitution that stops same-sex marriages from happening, which these things matter in the context of, okay, right now there are federal protections, Obergefell versus Hodges at the Supreme Court level, which protects same-sex marriages. But if that were to fall, advocates for this amendment argue, then such unions in Virginia basically are just not legal. And then the one with voting rights, basically 3 previous governors had worked on streamlining that process. So if, the logic is if you've served your time and you want to be able to vote again, there you go. Governor Glenn Youngkin's administration quietly adjusted that process within the last 2 years, and now it's petition-based. And I've been in touch with a lot of people who have told me they don't know what the criteria is. An email was forwarded to me where hundreds of people received a rejection email that was kind of copy-pasted and not blind carbon copied. So everyone actually started talking on the chain. There are actually some Republicans that are basically going, I hope I can vote in 2025 for Winsome Sears. But now I'm really frustrated with my party. Obviously, a lot of would-be Democratic voters who still weren't able to participate this past fall in congressional and presidential elections. And then the constitutional amendment to enshrine abortion rights. Obviously, we've seen with the fall of Roe versus Wade at the federal level, it's down into the states. And, advocates for this will tell you time and time again, Virginia is the last southern state that doesn't have, a deep restriction or a near total ban. So far, the constitutional amendments have advanced through the House. The voting rights one and the same-sex marriage one had bipartisan support. The reproductive choice one was on party line votes. Obviously, Democrats are, on board with that. Republicans are not. These have to pass this year and next year before the rest of us get to decide when it possibly appears as a ballot referendum. So it's a long journey, and I just had a long ramble. I'm sorry.
You weren't rambling, Charlotte.
I have a question. So I guess I'm wondering, where does Governor Glenn Youngkin play into this? What power does he have over the amendments at this point? And we're going to have a new governor this time next year. Could that potentially change the landscape for these pieces of legislation?
Not with these particular pieces, because the whole, judicial, executive, and legislative, the 3 powers equally divided branch government structure. Constitutional amendments do not require governor's approval. So Youngkin can watch this process unfold. Sears or Spanberger or whoever else may be jumping in or not could potentially watch this process continue, but governors do not get to weigh in on it.
It's interesting that it seems like Governor Youngkin would be eager to veto all 3 of these, but he's not going to get an opportunity to do that because he's sort of cut out of this process.
He was actually asked about, he was asked about this on Monday when he gave his State of the Commonwealth address afterwards about the process, and he mentioned the fact that governors don't have any veto powers over the amendments, and he's respecting the process, and that's the way it's written, and so it's going to be up to the lawmakers, and then eventually up to the voters twice potentially, depending on who they elect for next year's session, and depending on how that goes, might get a chance to finally vote on the 3 amendments.
Yeah, and as I said, unlike regular state laws, which can cycle in and out with the partisan turnover of who controls each chamber, who's governor, who can sign it or veto it or amend it, constitutional amendments are a much longer process. You know, it's stronger protection once it's there, but you have to work twice as hard to even get it there.
Yeah, and those are all 3 things Democrats are eager to campaign on, too. They want to hit the campaign trail and talk about that stuff. Charlotte, before we move on, Republicans also have a constitutional amendment that they're trying to pass, too, right?
Yeah, earlier last week, there was a press conference where Lieutenant Governor Winsome Sears actually lent her support to a proposed constitutional amendment, which would enshrine some, quote-unquote, right-to-work laws. So basically, as a right-to-work state, we are one of X number of states in the country that basically say you don't have to join a union. You can if you want to. And when you do join unions, you offer up parts of your paycheck to union dues, which covers a lot of different things. I'm not going to go into the long myriad of what that entails, but Republicans are pushing forward on that proposed constitutional amendment because, it's also something they want to campaign on and talk about. And then it's also something, if they put it into the state's constitution, Virginia can potentially be a right-to-work state for much longer than it would be if it, again, subject to turnover, particularly in the House of Delegates, where they're up for election every other year, unlike Senate and governor, which is, every 4.
Yeah, and it definitely seems that the lieutenant governor will be making this one of her big platform issues, obviously being at the press conference. And I believe it was back in December when she and former Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger appeared at the first event together. Mind you, they're separated by several hours, but it was the Virginia Economic Summit. And I think each had about 10 minutes to address the crowd of business leaders at the Richmond Convention Center. And a good portion of the lieutenant governor's speech was about right to work and protecting that and leaving it as is in Virginia.
Cameron Thompson of CBS 6, you're next on this. What's your headline of the week?
Well, for me, it's got to be that we are now entering, I guess, week 2 or 2.5, depending on how you consider it, of the General Assembly session, as I'm sure Patrick's going to be getting into a little later. We got a bit of a late start to session this year because of the water crisis here in the city, and obviously starting off the last full session that Governor Glenn Youngkin will be overseeing as governor, and gave his second to last State of the Commonwealth address. I'm sure most people know who, if they're listening to this podcast, governors can't serve consecutive terms in Virginia, but he sort of went through sort of like what his wish list is for this last full session, and sort of looking back during his address, he really highlighted what he saw as his wins in those 3 years of office, meaning job growth, funding for education and mental health, talking about how more people are now moving into Virginia than moving out of, bringing down violent crime, and giving tax cuts to Virginians. And it was really that last item that, was part of his big budget proposal. He spent some time in the speech there. The 2 sort of big ones he talked about were the no tax on tips and the car tax, which he's used the line several times, the most hated tax since the one on tea, or some iteration of that. And I know he's said full elimination probably not possible this year. He's saying using over $1 billion to create a tax rebate program for single family individuals, who $150 if you make $50,000 or less, and then a $300 rebate for those make joint filers of $100,000 a year or more. And the no tax on tips, he's saying, would apply to people in the food service, hospitality industry, and would cost about $70 million from state coffers if approved. And some other headlines from that speech that jumped out. I know its legislation is working its way through addressing the drone crisis that's sort of going all across the country here, saying bring me a bill to penalize people flying drones over national security or defense sites, talking about withholding funding from localities for not complying with ICE detainers, and then a $50 million scholarship program to let low-income students hypothetically go to private schools. Now, some of those things, especially those last 2, really non-starters with the Democrats who control both chambers of the General Assembly, saying, Senator Louise Lucas, who chairs the Senate Finance Committee, saying, she's heard the school voucher program each year. She's not going to let that pass. Speaker Don Scott said that the speech was very on brand for Youngkin, and said while Youngkin, he gives him credit for talking about the gains that the Commonwealth has made, he is saying that's because of what lawmakers have done, not what Youngkin has done. So each saying they're the ones responsible. I know Majority Leader Scott Surrevell, his response was he didn't like some of the other aspects that the governor spoke about wanting to get rid of the Virginia Clean Economy Act, and also said that he didn't talk about the challenges that he feels Virginia will be facing with the incoming Trump administration, namely one of the things being the loss of federal jobs with the DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency, talking about that. So, they did say as well, they're glad to see Governor Youngkin talk about maternal health, but at the same time saying, if he's recognizing that now we had bills previously that he has vetoed on this issue. So, that's sort of laying the groundwork here of what the last session is going to be like, what his priorities are. Already seeing sort of a response from Democrats in terms of how they feel about that idea, because they obviously have their own agenda they're dealing with. And, we're 5 days in, and it's already felt like a lot more than 1 week at the General Assembly session in terms of everything we've packed into for those extra 3 days that we lost.
Well, yeah, I was actually going to ask you about the 3 days. So this is a 45-day session. That is lightning fast. This thing's going to be over almost before it began, right? And they're going to lose. They already have lost 3 full days out of their 45-day session. Cameron, is there any indication that that might elongate the session, or that we might have to come back on the weekend? Or, how are they going to deal with the loss of those 3 days?
I know everybody's working for the weekend, but hopefully we don't have to work on the weekend. I know Speaker Don Scott said that he doesn't think it's going to lead to a longer session, and I know Minority Leader in the Senate, Senator Ryan McDougal, said they don't think that they're going to have to go past the 45 days, but Speaker Don Scott did say that it could lead to some weekend sessions, and I know listening in on one of the Senate committees this morning, the chair, Senator Favola, was mentioning to some lawmakers they had, I think, about 4 or 5 of the bills were passed by for the day, and she warned them that because this is that shorter lightning fast session, if you keep asking your bills to be passed by for the day, there is a good chance that the legislation just might not have the time to get heard, because obviously, we've got the morning meetings, we've got the floor, then the afternoon, so they can't just drag these on.
Plus
and on
crossover.
And on. Yep.
There comes a certain point in every session, the midway point, where anything that each chamber has not gotten to cannot cross over, because bills have to be approved by both chambers before, the governor can even look at them.
Mm-hmm.
Patrick Larson of VPM News, you're next with this. What's your headline of the week?
My headline is data centers. So just a little background really quick. We have tons of data centers in Virginia. Loudoun County has the biggest concentration of these high energy use facilities on the planet. Some estimates say that 70% or more of the globe's internet traffic actually goes through Virginia, which is pretty staggering if you think about it. These facilities over the past 2 or 3 decades that they've been being built, they bring lots of tax revenue, they bring jobs to the localities that hosts them, but they also have really huge sort of unintended impacts. The big one being the impact on the energy system. So right now in Virginia, we've had basically the same energy demand or close to it for a long time because of things like energy efficiency. And now we're kind of looking at a doubling in electric demand over the next 15 years.
Doubling. Wow.
Yeah, which is really staggering. It's also coming at a time that Virginia, the legislature, and the previous governor passed the Virginia Clean Economy Act, which Cam mentioned, which puts us on a timeline to get to zero carbon emissions from the energy sector by 2050. And now our biggest electric utility, Dominion Energy, is basically saying with this added demand, it's going to be impossible to meet that goal while also removing all greenhouse gas emissions from the grid. So we're a little bit between a rock and a hard place there, and it'll be really interesting to see what people do. And actually, just last week, we saw a raft of bills from a bipartisan group of legislators be introduced. A lot of these are largely based on a state report that came out last year that takes a closer look at some of the impacts of these facilities. And so we're seeing things like new protections for residents that live near these facilities, saying they have to be zoned in industrial areas, and creating new efficiency standards. Data centers get a lot of tax credits from the state. That's one of the reasons we have so many of them here. So some legislators are saying we should be tying those benefits to certain efficiency standards that will be kind of worked out by data centers and by state groups over the next year or so. It'll be really interesting to see what becomes of that. Like I said, there's some bipartisan support. It's mostly Democrats running these bills, but you do have some Republicans involved. The governor did actually bring up data centers in his State of the Commonwealth address. He basically said he wants to see local control over these decisions, and some of this legislation could butt up against that. So
Well,
I like that you I like that you mentioned local control, because everything somehow always comes back to the Dillon rule. We're a state where
yeah,
localities have to say "Mother, may I" to the legislature, but also at the same time they can say to the legislature on certain things. And so you see that with data centers at times. You see it with solar energy siting, which is, when the Virginia Clean Economy Act was first, passing in 2020, one of the big things people were looking at was offshore wind and solar panel siting around the state, and how much of it is going to be solar farms and solar on top of buildings and XYZ. But then over the last few years, you see some localities not embracing solar, and it's their authority to do so. But then we have this state goal of let's get cleaner energy.
Yeah.
And then we have, like you said, we're in this hard place because we have this, all these data centers and all the energy demand that needs.
Yeah, that's like a really interesting aspect of this discussion, sort of like a regional conflict, if you will. Data centers are starting to pop up. I mean, they're all over the state, and you're increasingly seeing them in central Virginia and southwest Virginia. But there's also like a lot of consternation about the big solar build-outs that are required to meet our energy demands. A lot of localities in southwestern Virginia feel like, that work is kind of getting put on them, sort of foisted on them by Northern Virginia, and that's like definitely made for some, arguments, some conflict at Capitol Hill, and yeah, it'll be really interesting to see what comes of it. There's also a lot of interesting bills on that, but I'll stick to the data centers right now.
I thought it was interesting in the governor's speech that Cameron went through I thought it was interesting. The governor kind of said two things that were a little conflicting. He said data centers are important. We need more of them. Virginia's the capital of data centers. So that was one thing. He also said local governments should have the authority to veto them too, right? So those are conflicting things, aren't they?
Yeah, I think so. I think, what he's getting at is that like some of the bills, and actually there are a couple bills that are not necessarily part of this raft that I'm discussing, that so one sponsored by Senator Danica Roem from Manassas, who is a Democrat that has carried legislation related to data centers before. She actually
probably the most anti-data center member of the General Assembly.
And
right,
she admitted at a press conference last week that it's a possibility that her bills will not get a majority of support. And basically, like her land use bill is just a little bit more clearly stated, whereas a version of the bill that Delegate Josh Thomas is sponsoring would, give localities a little bit more decision-making power, whereas Danica's would basically just say you have to have these facilities in these specific areas or you can't build them.
All right. Well, now it's time for some insider info. This is when our top reporters reveal the story behind the story, giving us an inside scoop on Virginia politics. Cameron Thompson of CBS 6, you're first with this. What's your insider info?
Well, for me, it was interesting. This is my second year getting to do full General Assembly coverage here, and it was neat. I think it was on Thursday or Wednesday of last week, while we were following the school voucher program that I mentioned in the State of the Commonwealth, where we had some of the students with the Capital News Service from Virginia Commonwealth University, sort of the next generation of journalists who could be, they're already covering the Capitol. They actually do some great work covering more of the in the weeds bills that some of us might not get to on the day-to-day coverage. And we're just talking about, we're in new media right now in this podcasting form. I know you're a radio guy by trade. I came from radio doing television, but it was interesting. I think we had about 10, maybe 12 students there. And when I was Tyler Englander, who was a TV reporter with WRIC here in town, who I knew was on Pond, Virginia, he sort of asked them, what brand of media are you guys in? Are you all looking, TV, radio? And every single one of them, from what I recall, put up their hand and said, new media. And so it's just, again, showing the changing landscapes. And so I love that we still have such a good contingent of reporters here covering what's going on. No, Charlotte, I guess you're in the new media realm here. being with Virginia Mercury and coming from the oldest version here, coming from print.
She's a recovering legacy journalist.
Yes. I'm actually kind of pinching myself because as a former VCU alum, when I did my master's there, I did Capitol News Service reporting from the Capitol, and I just fell in love with it. And all that time I kept saying, like, I hope and Virginia Mercury was launching in like 2018, so it's still pretty young States Newsroom overall. And I remember thinking, man, I would love to work for Times Dispatch or Virginia Mercury, and now I've been able to work for both, and I'm just really grateful. But definitely being in a newer form of media, online nonprofit, the beauty of that is there's no paywall because you can reach more people, but also with no paywall, you still have a little bit of the, oh my God, are we going to survive? Is this actually going to work? The same existential dread I felt when I was at, legacy media. What are the corporate overlords going to do? But I think I can tell you, I guess, being in a new form of media, it feels a little bit safer, and I appreciate the accessibility of online nonprofits and really just like any nonprofit outlet, whether you're print, radio, or online.
I love the visiting delegation of students. It was great to see them in the General Assembly building. So,
because we had some from your former school. Didn't
I was
we,
actually
as
just
well?
about to do a shout out to the visiting contingent of high school students from Alexandria City Public High School that were in the building last week, including the editor of the high school newspaper. So, journalism, is still alive and well with the visiting delegation of students. All right, Patrick Larson of VPM News, you're next on this one. What's your insider info?
So as Cam alluded to earlier, we're going to be discussing the water crisis in Richmond, which delayed the start of the General Assembly session. So just for a little context, us here in Richmond, some of us went days without any running water whatsoever. I think we had a boil water advisory imposed for 6 days because of a power outage that led to some mechanical failures at our water treatment plant. There's been so much coverage on this. I would encourage anyone listening to go read about it. There's so many good stories. And big development in the past week is that the DPU, the Department of Public Utilities Director for the City of Richmond, April Bingham, resigned. My fellow reporter, Kairos Manzanares, spoke with Mayor Danny Avula about this. He says that it was a mutual agreement, the resignation. They have a new interim director, Anthony Scott Morris, coming in, who is a professional engineer. He has a background at the State Department of Environmental Quality. And basically the situation now is water's back on. We have a lot of pumps in place, including some sort of like auxiliary external pumps that are, providing some redundancy to the system. And really everybody is just taking this time now to take a close look at the operations of the city's water utility. Journalists obviously have been doing this. Also, state oversight officials, the mayor himself, it's important to remember that when this started, he was, I think, less than a week into his term. So he is, talking about bringing in outside like third-party consultants to take a closer look at what went wrong with this and also what is more generally going on with the system at large. We heard that Delegate Ray Cousins, who's a local representative, is going to be requesting, I think, $650,000 for, basically to cover damages to the plant. But the outlook is that it'll likely be much more expensive than that. So we're just going to have to, kind of see what comes up.
And I know sort of to that point that you mentioned, the city has their investigation. I believe, Henrico is launching their own investigation because it wasn't just the city of Richmond impacted by this, but Hanover and Henrico get some of their water from the city. They've got their investigations. Governor Youngkin says the state's doing their own investigation. And, we've also seen, I know Delegate Mike Jones sort of took this as like this is, unfortunately perfect timing for this to happen, to have state lawmakers in town to see the impact of this, because the treatment plant was 100 years old back in 2024, and saying just the need for state money to help with aging infrastructure, but whether or not other lawmakers go along with that, they were saying, let's tap the brakes here, see what exactly was this human error? Did they delay some infrastructure improvements they should have done? I know Speaker Don Scott, a Democrat, and Delegate Mike Cherry, Senator Ryan McDougall all sort of said, let's see if they use the money they've got in the past correctly before we just give them more money. And I know there's also, you talked about Bingham resigning, kind of beat some potential legislation that I know both McDougal and Senator Glenn Sturtevant said that they're going to put forward this session to require that you have an engineering degree to be the head of a major waterworks, something that Bingham didn't have, but the new interim head does.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think one of the reasons that Bingham was appointed was because of DPU's track record of kind of having poor customer service. A lot of Richmonders, when they have problems with their water bill or their service, it's just like hard to get a hold of anybody to, tell you what's going wrong and try to get things fixed. So yeah, definitely interesting perspective there. And as far as the money goes, I think it's also worth noting that, Richmond has a lot of other very old infrastructure. Our natural gas distribution system is also really old. Our wastewater and sewer, we regularly ask for, big chunks of money, like $50 to $100 million every year from the General Assembly to try to reduce the number of sewer overflows, basically to cut down on the amount of poop going into the James River.
Don't swim after a heavy rain.
Yes, wait like 3 days after a heavy rain to get in the James River. So we'll see what comes of all this.
Yeah, and I don't think Richmond is alone in having very old water infrastructure across the state, but I think all of us are going to have a lot of reports to pour over in the next few weeks and months. But from there can come a lot of different types of solutions to help prevent this kind of crisis from happening again here or elsewhere, I would believe.
And I'll say I've been looking at bacteria samples for the water system in Richmond over like the past 2 or 3 years, and things are good. There's not bacteria in your water.
Good to know. News you could use. All right. We're only 3 episodes into this new podcast, but this is the first one where the word poop has made a reference. So thank you, Patrick Larson, on that one. Charlotte Woods, you're next on this one. What's your insider info?
Just one last thing on the poop front. In a press call with Mayor Avila recently, a lot of us reporters didn't shower for days, like we just couldn't. And then finally, when the boil water advisory was still in place, but water had returned, it was, that advisory was just an abundance of caution for drinking it. But at that point, Avila said we can bathe in it, and another reporter had brought up, like, is it safe to shower? And it was like, yes, take a shower, and there's no poop in the water. And you just, again, you don't expect to hear that in a press conference. What was the question?
The question was, going back to the format of our show, what's your insider info?
Insider info. Pivoting to something heavier, but amid the allegations that have been coming out of Red Onion State Prison over in Southwest Virginia, I have been in the last couple of months in touch with some people that are living there, and I'm in the process of, some of them are happy to speak on record, some are definitely a little bit hesitant and nervous, but I think amid everything that's happening and the allegations and the forthcoming investigation from the state's new corrections ombudsman, I just am excited to be hearing from people who are actually there, who can share their own anecdotes and experiences, and whatever I can possibly investigate and maybe file some records requests I will be working on. But in the meantime, that's the part of this job that sometimes we get in the weeds talking to people that don't always get to have their voices heard, and we have to work a little harder to do that. And it's pretty heavy, but it's pretty rewarding, and just reminds me that we are the vessel between the people in power and the people not in power, and how to bridge that communication gap.
And can you peel back the layers here and tell us a little bit about how you're actually communicating with them? Because you've taken an approach to this that's really smart.
So there is actually, it's called JPay. It's like the way that people who are incarcerated can talk to their friends and family. It's not free, so I've just been paying, and I will seek reimbursement later for my newsroom if it's possible. But it's a bit of a delay though. So I've been reaching out to some people through JPay. We've been communicating back and forth and trying to set up some phone calls. But it is one of the key ways that people do stay in touch with their loved ones. And then just on the Red Onion State Prison front, like the new corrections ombudsman, she's currently still staffing up her office, making hires. I've been checking in pretty regularly. She did commit late last year to doing an investigation into Red Onion and see, how much of these allegations, which have ranged from, racism, religious discrimination, abuse, prolonged use of solitary confinement, which Virginia technically doesn't call it that. We call it restorative housing. There have been some movement on that front. I know I think it was 2023, Youngkin did sign a bill that allowed for when an inmate is placed in solitary, they do have X amount of hours each day to be let out of solitary, because when you are confined by yourself for long periods of time, it can really do a number on you mentally. Although I've heard allegations that that's not happening as much as it should per the law that Youngkin signed. And some Democratic lawmakers, Senator Lamont Bagby has introduced a couple of times a bill that would further build on some, solitary confinement reform to say, like, okay, is there somewhere in between removing someone from general population and solitary? So like a bridge, because usually solitary is used for when someone has had repeated infractions or might be dangerous to themselves or others. And he's, his proposal also outlines, like, okay, well, if you are placing someone in solitary, can we check on their mental health regularly? Because once you get in there, it might be very hard to get out, because I can't imagine being confined that way for a long period of time. So yeah, and a couple of different state lawmakers have visited Red Onion. So between the allegations, between a forthcoming investigation and potential continued work on what the lawmakers might do, there's lots to keep track of, and I will just keep keeping track.
Most likely, again, because we're in a short session, I know that the Senator Bagby bill on the reducing solitary confinement, I believe, passed the Senate committee this morning. I believe the same one was vetoed last year by the governor. I know Department of Public Safety was there saying that they felt that there was conflicting language that said basically capped it at 15 days no matter what, and they felt that it was, it puts the rest of the population and the guards at risk here. But just back to the original point, is this likely something that we're going to see movement on next legislative session versus this session we're going to see much? I
mean, Youngkin did veto it in 2024, and his logic was, well, I signed a bill last year related to this, and I felt like that was sufficient. And I would expect it could continue to advance this session. It is largely a Democratic-led issue. It's not totally partisan, but I could see it potentially clearing both chambers again and winding up in front of Youngkin again. But you will have to see how he feels, if anything changes in the legislation itself or in his viewpoint by the time it potentially gets to his desk. And if it doesn't make it there, or it does face another veto, we'll see the next session. Like you said, there's always every year. Yeah, I remember the big one last year that had bipartisan support. So it is something that both sides are keen to work on, is the use of attack dogs in prison, because I remember there was that Business Insider report showing just the big jump in between how many times Virginia uses attack dogs versus the rest of the states that still use those in prison. I believe it was delegates Siebold and Wibert that put forward that legislation that was passed and signed into law. So there is that bipartisanship there on that issue. So definitely.
All right, changing the course of our conversation just a little bit. Now it's time for our game show segment, Buy, Sell, or Hold. I'll present a topic, and our panelists will make a choice. Do you want to buy, sell, or hold? Our topic today, the 10 a.m. State of the Commonwealth address. So for many years, this is the big speech the governor gives every year. It was a nighttime speech for a long time. Governor Glenn Youngkin moved it to the afternoon, but this year we had that water crisis, and it was a twist, and the governor delivered it at 10 a.m., which was a really unusual time for this big-time speech. So this is the topic for our buy, sell, or hold this week, the 10 a.m. speech. Charlotte Woods, Patrick Larson, you're first on this. Buy, sell, or hold on a speech delivered when people are still drinking their breakfast tea.
Well, first I want to say I'm a longtime fan of the buy, sell, hold segment. I'm really honored to be here. And I am going to be a sell on this one. I understand there were extenuating circumstances, and I think we probably won't see this again, hopefully. But I think I'd really like to see it go back to prime time. I just think the business of the Commonwealth deserves that prime time attention, and I think that's the message we should be sending. I
strong disagree with you on that one, because the primetime speech means I'm working until midnight.
Yeah, I also am not usually covering it, so maybe that's easy for me to say.
Easy for you to say, buddy. Charlotte Woods, you're next on this. Buy, sell, or hold on the 10 a.m. speech.
I love your mindset on why you said it that way because, as someone who used to be a local government reporter, and city council meetings are in the evenings, which allows for more participation, and we all want more participation in democracy. This is a governor giving a speech. People are going to be able to listen to it or read our coverage of it. And for our job, since session is chaotic and long for all of the lawmakers and reporters and everyone who works in that building, so I'm going to say bye the morning, because it gets it out of the way early in the day, and then you could just let it marinate the thoughts while you're moving on to covering other things as well. So I'm going to buy it.
Cameron Thompson, you're the last one to answer on this one. Buy, sell, or hold on the 10 a.m. speech.
Very, very strong buy on this one, and because I'm coming from the TV side of things, where our shows are 4, 5, 6 o'clock, so we sort of a 2.5 hour block, and so his speech in the previous years, I believe, started at 4 o'clock, and then was wrapping up in the start of the 5 o'clock hour. So in terms of turning that around and to immediately going to talk about what he just talked about doesn't leave a lot of time to go through everything, get a response from the other side, regardless of which governor is giving that speech. So it just gives more time from the TV broadcast side of things. But again, just because the age we live in with new media, get the carrying in a prime time type thing. But I don't know how many stations broke into regular coverage and aired it by itself, and we've got YouTube put it on their own sites there, so strong buy. But I will say I am disappointed that nobody held, because I was looking forward to doing my first boo, because I know that's what you're supposed to do.
I got the sound effect all queued up and ready right here.
Or you buy, sell. What are you buy, sell, hold?
You're going to flip the script and ask me?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, it's only fair.
I would definitely be a strong buy on the 10 a.m. Because it gives you a chance to read it, digest it, ask questions about it, then write your script, then fact check everything. And so, you get a better news product out of it. However, having said all that, so that's, our motivations as journalists. If you think about the governor's motivation, it moved to prime time because Governor Chuck Robb felt like if he moved it from, it used to be like a noontime speech. If he moved it from noon to nighttime, then he could be on live television. Well, we live in a different age now. I mean, that worked for Governor Robb, but, that's not the world that we live in. I doubt they cut into CBS programming for the governor's speech, right?
And honestly, having the speech happen in the morning, I feel like the news consumption with so many different outlets and ways to get it. I mean, you're going to be scrolling on your phone or logging on to your computer, either over breakfast, at lunch, and then again in the evening. So if the speech is happening in the morning, people can catch up on their lunch break. And if not, then they've got the evening cast to go catch up. And then we all get to carry on, and the lawmakers get to carry on with all the other business that has to happen in 45 or 60 days.
Yeah, and Michael, what kind of life are you leading where you're still drinking your morning tea at 10 a.m.? What time do you get up at?
English breakfast tea. All right, you can drink it all day. All right. Now we're going to open up our reporter's notebook. This is when our top journalists tell us what to be on the lookout for this week. Charlotte Woods of the Virginia Mercury, you're first on this. What's in your reporter's notebook?
I personally am going to be keeping a good watch on maternal health bills and mental health bills. These are two areas that have seen some bipartisanship. And also right before session started, members of both parties did make big proclamations that they're going to be pushing for these measures. The Democrats have largely been leading on maternal health for a while. They sort of teased their, quote, momnibus package later in the summer.
They love that word.
They more formally launched it towards the end of the year. And for anyone who's not as much of a nerd listening to this, omnibus is usually like a type of package where you have a lot of related bills clumped together. And so momnibus was a very clever little pun there. And then, Governor Glenn Youngkin towards the end of the year also announced a lot of budgetary items and legislation that he'll have his eye on that would, advance maternal health in the state. There are a lot of maternal health deserts where certain hospitals, and particularly in Southwest and South Side, have stopped their obstetrics units. Rural patients do have to travel further for care. Black maternal health has always been a problem that people have been trying to address. I know that the Black lady senators and delegates have really been doing this work for years now, and several of them have told us, we welcome the governor hopping on board. They are going to say tisk tisk for some of the things that he has vetoed, so they're going to have their eye on if he has changed his mind. as some of those bills they try again on. And then in the mental health, the Right Help Right Now plan that Youngkin has been championing we're in the third year of it now. It is like a series of budget requests and related legislation. Lawmakers have already come together on this front. In particular, one that I'm going to have my eye on is more towards the later of the session when the budget negotiations are going. Youngkin had asked for $35 million, I believe that was the number, to use like special conservators of the peace, which are like court mandated people that can be sitting with people who are under temporary detention orders when they have to go be mentally evaluated. And the argument there is that law enforcement is currently what most often does it, and they're not always the best people to be responding because that could agitate someone who's already having the worst day of their life and in a fragile state. And the argument from a lot of sheriffs and police chiefs is saying, like this is taking our officers and deputies out of the field where they could be doing what they were hired to do. Additionally, there are mobile crisis units that have been established in recent years, which is where clinicians, people who are mental health experts, this is their life calling, they are also doing a lot of first responding. So I'm just really excited to watch how all these things unfold and also see, hold people accountable. You said you want bipartisanship on this. Let's see you do it.
Cameron Thompson of CBS 6, you're next on this. What's in your reporter's notebook?
Well, assuming most people are going to be listening to this as soon as the episode drops, like I do, at 6 a.m.
Bright and early.
This morning.
You're drinking your English breakfast tea.
And listening at 2 times speed as well, I might say.
Not please don't do
2x
that.
is a little excessive.
Oh, 2x is the way to go, man. That's how I listen to the podcast. But I'll be watching later today the inauguration of our 45th president becoming our 47th president with President-elect Donald Trump, and specifically what actions he'll be taking. Obviously, he said a lot of what he will do when he gets into the White House for the second time, and what direct impact that might be having on Virginia with any executive actions or legislation that might be passed by Congress, which is both controlled by the Republicans, although by slim majorities, and just if that changes the mood at the General Assembly, if he's issuing all of these executive actions, if that's changing, this calls of bipartisanship among local lawmakers, and then just potentially any indirect impact that this presidency might have on the upcoming elections in November. Because as we've heard in Virginia, the party that is not in power in the White House typically has the inside edge for winning the governor's mansion, and as we have all of the House of Delegates and the governor, lieutenant governor, and the AG's race. So just sort of seeing how second time around, what impact that might have on Virginia politics, because I don't think being right next to D.C., it's not something that's easily ignored.
Mm-hmm. And last time I remember when the first term of Trump, that really played a significant role in the quote-unquote blue wave back in 2017.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned DOGE earlier, the Department of Government Efficiency. We obviously have a lot of government workers and contractors in Northern Virginia especially. I mean, is that something you're keeping an eye on? Are you looking for maybe waves of layoffs or?
We'll be watching that because I remember it was shortly after, I think Dave West with RTD had asked the governor, are you concerned about this talk about, government efficiency? And he sort of said at the time, and I know he signed on to the letter with other Republican governors saying that, we support looking for inefficiencies, streamlining government so we're not wasting taxpayer dollars. It said, that was something he was trying to do when he came into the governor's mansion here in Virginia. And then he did say, I think the number he gave at the time was there are 250,000 open jobs here in Virginia, so there is work to be had for those who are impacted. But he has signed off saying he supports this initiative, but we'll see how quickly DOGE comes to be and just how drastically they go through with the number of cuts they said they wanted to do. And just one of the other ones, again, back to his talk of the ICE detainers and not not giving funding to localities that aren't complying with that, is he also signed on to that letter saying, we support his talk about the mass deportations and utilizing state resources to assist with that, and see does that mass deportation come to fruition, and what part, if any, does Virginia and other states play in with that?
Patrick Larson of VPM News. Bring it on home here for a strong finish to the episode. What's in your reporter's notebook this week?
Invasive species. This is an area of interest for me. I am always looking to see what the GA's got on the table. And this year we're looking at a sort of a redo of a bill that was passed by the GA last year. This is a labeling bill, so anywhere, like any greenhouse you would go to that sells a species that is on like a list of 30 or 40 invasive plants.
So our listeners know we're talking about like English ivy.
Yes, an English ivy,
It would
tree
be
of
the-
heaven.
They can like choke out other plants.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, basically like, you know, they're non-native plants that are disruptive to our native ecosystems. Once you learn how to recognize something like English ivy, and you go through a walk through like James River Park, or really, you know, any park in the state of Virginia, you'll very likely notice a lot of it. It'll kind of feel like it's following you around. Been my feeling. And so yeah, this bill in particular is a labeling bill. It's kind of like you know. You think of like cigarette packets have like these big labels on them, like warning labels on them. This would essentially be the same thing. It's just a quick explanation of what invasive species are, the risks to, you know, wildlife, to infrastructure, all that sort of thing, and just kind of allowing consumers to make their decisions based on that.
Last year, there was a lot of debate about where do you put the sign? Do you put the sign at the front door as you walk in, or do you put the sign on the plants?
So I think the way it's written now is that it would be on the plants. Yeah, so it was vetoed, like I said, by the governor last year. He had some concerns about, you know, is the list that this bill is referencing to general, and so now the names of all the plants are actually written down in the bill if you want to.
So the governor did not like the fact that it was a third-party list. It was a list that somebody else had created, and we have no control over what appears on that list or is added to that list or taken away from that list. And so that was one of his concerns. So the strategy, the new strategy they're now taking is that forget about the list from the third party. We're going to create our own list, and it might be smaller, but it'll definitely have English ivy. But then, as you were just pointing out, it's not like English ivy is going to be on the list. These are all Latin names, right?
Yeah. So you're going to have to do a little studying there, I think. But yeah, I think, you know, the approach is interesting because one of the things you hear from people who deal with invasives a lot is that, you know, the ones that we're seeing, you know, out in the environment, they're coming from landscaping usually. I've done a lot of reporting on the tree of heaven. That is actually a plant that we believe was introduced in a Philadelphia garden before the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So yeah, long history there, and it'll be interesting to see what comes of it.
All right, well, that's it for this episode of The Press Room. Hit the subscribe button on your favorite podcasting app. Write a review on Apple Podcasts, and we'll be back next week for the next episode of The Virginia Press Room.